Hello, I'm Sal Mercogliano, Associate Professor of History at Campbell University in North Carolina. I'm a former merchant mariner and a adjunct professor of maritime industry policy at the U.S. Merchant Marine Academy. In this special episode of What's Going On in the Suez, we're actually not going to talk about the Suez at all. We're going to talk about the year in review, 2020. I've got a lot of new followers. A lot of you are following me because of maritime related information. So I thought I'd do a special episode here which talks about the previous year. The boys over at G Captain, specifically Mike Schuller, particularly, and there's men and women there, uh, put together a great piece beginning of this year that looked at 2020 in review. And I thought I'd look at their top 10 stories, kind of set some context for many of you who are finding out maritime news for the first time, or maybe not have had access to it before in the past. Other thing too is making sure my microphone's working. Got a lot of comments on my last video. I apologize. For some reason, this microphone right here dropped out, and so I was just using my computer's microphone. So I have adjusted it. I've actually upped the volume a little bit. So hopefully audio quality is fantastic right now. And if not, I know you will let me know. All right, let's go ahead and get over to the story right here. Again, this comes right from G Captain, and I will have the link in the store in the show notes for you right here. So this is the year in review. This came out at the end of last year, December 29th, 2020. And there are 10 stories in here. I want to talk about each of them just a little bit of detail. Again, I'll link right here to the stories. And there are links within the stories to delve in a little bit deeper. So the first thing that was talked about, really the big story of 2020 was IMO 2020. IMO is the International Maritime Organization. This is the entity that basically creates international regulations for shipping under the UN. And specifically, what IMO 2020 was attempting to do was implement a provision whereby pollutants from the vessel, especially from the ship's stacks, decreases the amount of sulfur being dumped into the atmosphere, not carbon dioxide, but sulfur, down from 3.5% per million down to 0.5%. And that was going to be achieved in two ways. One was the use of this very low sulfur diesel fuel. It's a shift over from the high sulfur diesel fuel, which was basically just seen as not being the best fuel to be used, so a much dirtier fuel. So you're going to go over this very low sulfur fuel oil. Problem with it was it was going to be expensive. Also, wasn't going to be a lot of it around, and so there was issues about storing it and stockpiling it and making sure there was enough. The other way around it, if you couldn't get yourself some VLSFO, was to basically install scrubbers. Scrubbers required at a shipyard, and basically what you're doing is scrubbing the exhaust gas as it goes up. Problem with scrubbers too is they burn up after a while or they get used up. They also create some wastewater because they use a system of wastewater too that has to be pumped overboard. For example, Turkey right now isn't allowing vessels to transit its waters using scrubbers because of the waste associated with the scrubbers. And so that was going to be the huge story in 2020. IMO 2020 was going to be it. It was going to cause lots of problems, but all of a sudden, it really wasn't as big of an issue as everyone thought it was because COVID hit, which is the second story. COVID basically prevented a lot of flow of goods initially. Basically, world trade slowed down, tankers parked, not as many cargo ships were moving. And one of the things this allowed a lot of companies to do is get their ships in the shipyards, get scrubbers installed, and also allowed a stockpiling of this very low sulfur fuel. And vessels were able to get rid of their high sulfur fuel oil, or better yet, burn it and not tell anybody, which is also happens, unfortunately. So, second story is, of course, COVID, the outbreak of COVID-19. We saw COVID really hit initially for most public people were on the cruise ships. But in truth, BIMCO, which is a basically looks at ship rates and charters, basically alerted to the potential of this happening much earlier. And one of the things that was begin the scene is this idea to quarantine vessels coming in and out of port to keep the crews isolated. There was a fear that the crews were going to spread it, but in truth, crews are so isolated on these vessels, it really wasn't going to be a big issue initially. And we haven't seen really outbreaks of COVID on board commercial vessels, except for the passenger liners, because of the mass numbers on board and the influx of crews on and off the vessels. Obviously, the biggest thing about COVID-19 for this is a series of impacts of it. So, for example, the stockpiling of oil was a big issue. The U.S. Navy's Military Sealift Command, which hires merchant mariners, ordered a gangway up order, basically kept their crews on board, wouldn't let them off the vessel, even though Navy crews were allowed to come and go and contractors were allowed to go. And it caused issues in the container market, all this that we'll take a look at here in some of these other sub stories. So COVID was the big story. So all of a sudden, IMO 2020 got supplanted by COVID, and COVID really became the primary story. And we're still basically dealing with that right now. The crew rotation, which we'll talk about in another story here, all these issues really stem from the outbreak of COVID. And I talked about this in an earlier video too. Stellar Banner. This is a bulker, the bulker Stellar Banner. She was leaving Brazil when she grounded. Bulk carriers, if you look at this imagery right here, and I'll try to blow up this picture here a little bit for you, give you a little bit of a better image here. There we go. So this is a blow up here of the Stellar Banner. One of the things you'll see is she looks like a tanker, but the way you can identify she's not a tanker is she doesn't have piping on her deck. Instead, she has these large hatches on her deck, and those hatches open up and you put bulk material in it. In the case of Stellar Banner, it's ore material. One of the things we see is she was carrying 270,000 tons of iron ore bound from Brazil for China. So one of the other stories that we've kind of talked about a little bit here is the poor relationships between Australia and China right now because of COVID-19. China has basically kept Australian ore from being offloaded. That's the primary place where China gets its ore, but the secondary place is Brazil. And so Stellar Banner here was loaded with ore. These are what's called Cape-size vessels. These vessels are so big they can only go around the Cape of Good Hope. Can't even go through the Suez Canal. These things are monstrous, and it's a shorter route anyway. Well, she grounded on her way out, which means she opened up her hull. The problem with ore carriers, particularly ore carriers, is ore is not symmetrical in shape. It's rocks basically, and rocks fill it up. A hole with rocks, you create voids and areas, and so one of the big issues you have with them is shifting of cargo. Bulk carriers are notoriously dangerous for a variety of reasons. Ore carriers, in particularly, will shift. And you can lose the vessel because of a massive list. It's not unusual to see a bulker a month go down, and these are big vessels. Add to it when you rupture the bottom on these vessels and you puncture the tanks, there's enough void area in there to fill with water and ore. And what you see here is her listing, heeling over to the starboard side right there. Just a absolutely worst position to be in on this. Stellar Banker could not be salvaged. And a matter of fact, she is eventually going to be lost. I'll put up this video here, which I think is a great video here. This is her going down right here. I want to make sure. Hang on a second here. Make sure you've got the audio here for this. So make sure I'm sharing the sound here. Here we go. Because the sound is fantastic to hear. They had basically got the fuel oil off her. They were attempted to get some of the ore off her, but they couldn't. And it was eventually deemed too difficult to salvage her. So she was sunk out there. And this is her going. You can see the water going into the hatches right there, blowing the top of the hatches off as they go in. The Air Force right there just blows it in. And you'll see the Stellar Banker going down here. It's a dramatic loss. Vessels go when they sink. They go with a lot of noise, a lot of imagery, and you see her going right there. That ore going out, you hear the sound coming out from the engine room in the stack. Those are the tugs blowing off their horns right there. And a little bit of excitement of watching the vessel go down.
Looking nice!
So sorry for the language. But mariners will get a little bit excited when they see this. You don't usually see a vessel sink. And again, no loss of life on the vessel at all. So it was a tragic loss right there for the vessel. But again, it does happen occasionally, and you saw that there with Stellar Banker. Next story: cruise shipping crisis. I'm going to do another separate video on this. There are some great YouTubers out there, I got to tell you, who cover the cruise ship in detail. And when I do my cruise ship video, I'll talk about that. They focus it mainly from the passenger's perspective. When can I go back cruising again? What's like on the cruise ships? I look at it from the industry side. So one of the big things that's been happening in the cruise ship industry, of course, is the layup of the cruise ships. But one of the things that the cruise ships have had to do is get rid of excess tonnage. They can't keep these huge fleets running as much as they can. So one of the things they've been doing is basically scrapping vessels. So right here, what you see are three Carnival ships. These are from the 1990s, the Fantasy class and two Royal Sovereigns coming in here. These were with Royal Caribbean Lines, and then they were with a subsidiary called Pulmonator, which is basically declared bankruptcy. They catered to Spanish cruisers. But this is the scrapping yard in Turkey. And you run these vessels ashore. It's a whole separate video right there, watching these things come screaming onto the beach here at full force. It is a strange sensation doing that. But one of the things, the problem is new vessels are on the way. They've been programmed. They're basically on the way, and so you can't stop building them. So you've got to kind of get rid of tonnage that's costing you money. And so that's what they're doing. They tried to sell them, but again, not many takers for used passenger liners from the 1990s. These vessels were state of the art when they came out. I remember seeing this Sovereign of the Seas down in Puerto Rico, late 80s, early 90s, and just amazed at the size of that vessel. And today she's dwarfed by modern passenger liners. Again, this ultra large motion has taken place not just in tankers and container ships, but also in the passenger trade. And so we see that being done there. Next big story, the fire on board the Bonhomme Richard. I have a series of videos. Actually, I did two videos when the fire took place. So beyond my credentials there, I've been a volunteer firefighter for 20 years. I've actually worked as a paid firefighter. I went through, I worked as a firefighter to get myself through grad school. And I've been a volunteer firefighter for 20 years. I'm a captain of my local fire department. So I did damage control on vessels, and I've been fighting fires ever since then. And one of the most amazing things about the fire on the Bonhomme Richard is the vessel had just come out of a shipyard, had not been put back into full service yet, so the full Navy crew wasn't on board. And what you had was a fire that took place in the lower vehicle deck, and the fire ran out of control. Normally, if this vessel had been at sea, fully manned, they would have been able to fight it. But since she was coming out of the shipyard, minimal crew on board, it was a disaster. I go into a lot of detail talking about it. The image you see here are four Shawest tugs helping fight the fire. They were not called in till long after this fire has been raging for hours. It was absolutely crazy that the port of San Diego, major Navy base, does not have major firefighting tugs. These are not firefighting tugs. These are normal harbor tugs right here who have firefighting capability on board, but not the amount of water needed to fight a fire of this size. If you go to ports like Long Beach and Los Angeles, San Francisco, major cargo ports, they have big firefighting tugs. And the reason you want big firefighting tugs isn't just so they can shoot water, but they can hook up to water main systems on board vessels and charge them. The problem on Bonhomme Richard is her fire mains were inoperative because her plant was inoperative. So you had to basically lug hoses onto the vessel. And the problem is they did not have enough water pressure coming from the shore side to fight this fire correctly. And what you had was the catastrophic loss of a major U.S. Navy combatant pierside in one of the largest Navy bases in the U.S. Bonhomme Richard has been decommissioned. She's going to be scrapped. They basically, and she had just come out of a massive shipyard period that was going to, have her in service for another 15, 20 years. She was going to start being able to operate these new F-35 Lightning jump jets, the ones that replaced the Harriers. And instead, what they got is a vessel that was just completely destroyed, gutted by the fire. Her island right here was a hollow shell. They nearly had lost her at the dock. She was flipping from port to starboard, which is never a good thing. So it was a major fire. I did two videos on these, and again, they're on my YouTube page. And if you're interested in that, that's there. Next, the crew change crisis. Go ahead and zoom in here a little bit so I'll make these a little bigger for you. Crew change crisis. So the crew change crisis was, of course, a major one. At by the fall of 2020, you had an issue where of the 1.2 million mariners who were at sea, about 400,000 were over their allotted time to go home. Now, under international labor maritime convention rules, you cannot work on a vessel more than 11 months. That's the limit. You can't do it. It's against the law to do that. And what that means is if you go into a port and they find crew members on board who are on over 11 months, they can basically prevent the vessel from sailing until the crew change takes place. And this is through port state agreements and port state control agreements made with nations. So, for example, U.S. Coast Guard, will go on board vessels that come in. They will check the crews, they will check paperwork, they'll check all the documentation, but they also check when the crews rotated. Well, the problem was you were going over rotations for a variety of reasons, not the least of which was countries were not allowing mariners to get off the vessel, go to an airport, and fly home because of restrictions. That happens periodically in U.S. ports all the time, that mariners are allowed to enter the U.S. through a series of paperwork. They're taken to an international airport and allowed to fly out and go home. And new crew members arrive and are taken to the port to embark. Happens all the time. Happens in ports throughout the world. Well, COVID prevented that. And what you had were mariners going well above their normal days on board. Now, that doesn't sound bad. Well, you're stuck on a vessel. At least you have toilet paper and food and you're getting paid. That sounds great. Problem is, you work 7 days a week on board a vessel, very minimal crews on a lot of these vessels. We talked about Ever Given with just 24 crew members on board. Uh, After a while, you get tired, you start losing your effectiveness, but more importantly, your relief is not getting paid. When you're not sailing, you're not getting paid. And so the relief is going to have to find a different job, and that relief may not be available to come back out there. If you finally get home after being on a vessel over 11 months, you may not want to go back to sea again. And so you're going to lose your mariners. And more importantly, they're tired and accidents happen. And one of the things we see here are these accidents begin to happen. Unfortunately, again, nation states, the flag nations, and the IMO, the International Maritime Organization, again, this is my opinion, did not do enough to lobby for these mariners. The problem you have is these most of these vessels are under flags of conveniences or in open registries. Panama, Liberia, Marshall Islands, you name it, they're all out there. And they didn't have the clout, in my opinion, to lobby these countries to allow these mariners to be, number one, deemed essential workers, to be able to use airports, to be able to fly home and affect this. One of the things the cruise lines had to do is cross deck their workers onto different vessels and literally sail the vessels halfway around the world to return them. That's something you can't do in this case. Matter of fact, there was a case of an Indian bulker that was going from Brazil to China, and the master diverted the vessel to India to effect a crew change. He did. He got himself off the vessel because he got fired, but he was worried about his crew being on for too long. And so the crew change was a major issue. And as you see here, as of 18 December, 46 member states and one associate member had designated seafarers as key workers. Again, that should be universal across the board because, again, maritime handles 70% of the world trade by value, and so it should be an essential workforce. Next, the tanker stocks Robin Hood moment. So one of the things that happened during COVID, as everybody stayed at home, oil production or oil consumption went down dramatically. I live in North Carolina, and price for gas was great. It was as low as anything. I mean, you can fill up your car, truck, whatever you got for almost nothing. It was insane. But one of the things that did was all of a sudden create the spot market, the ability to use tankers for one voyages, here and there. Again, one of the things I've talked about is you have consolidation in the container line industry. The three big ones, Royal Caribbean, Norwegian, Carnival, control 85% of the container of the passenger liners. The nine big container companies control 83% of the container market. But tankers are different because of the breakup of the Seven Sisters, because the seven big companies that had existed had a series of bad press with tankers, Amoco Cadiz, Exxon Valdez, you name it. They had to put their names on the side of the vessels. And once you start spilling oil everywhere, they got out of the oil business. And what you have is independent companies now running the oil business. And what happened here, because of COVID, you can't turn off oil wells. You can't turn off refineries. You keep producing. There's a finite amount of storage space ashore. And so what happened was people were chartering tankers to just be floating gas reserves. And that happens a lot actually in the tanker industry. Lots of times you fill a tanker, you sit and you wait for prices to go up, and then you sail your vessel to where it's the most economical. This happens all the time. The parking lot at Singapore, for example, is famous for this. There are hundreds of tankers sometimes off the coast of Singapore with that. Here in this moment, we saw massive amounts of oil being stored at this, and then a lot of people who were in that industry and a lot of people who invested in that industry made a lot of money very quickly because the spot rates for tankers were going through the roof. If you had an old tanker that you could never use before, but it could hold oil then, man, you made money. So it's interesting to watch the maritime industry to see the peaks and troughs of how to make money. Next story, and I've talked about this a little bit, is the Golden Ray Salvage. So, why were we so concerned about Ever Given straddling the Suez? Well, if she broke or she rolled over, this is what you get. This is Golden Ray, which is a excuse me, a car carrier coming out of Brunswick, Georgia in 2019, which basically capsized. She got top heavy. She hadn't taken enough ballast, probably. They're still doing this investigation. This is what I mean about the Ever Givens investigation. We're still waiting for the NTSB to come out with this investigation. It shouldn't take this long, but it does. And one of the things that the pilot on board mentioned is that, once he made the turn, this right hand turn out of the channel heading toward the main exit channel, a ship just started to roll on him and he couldn't control it. And fortunately, they were able, with enough way on, to pull the ship out of the channel and for it to roll over in shallow water. And you can see she's on the bottom there. She rolled over on her side. And what they're using now is this big, huge, massive, it's not really a crane so much, but it straddles these two barges. And what they do is they hold the vessel in place, then using anchor chain, just saw her in slices. And that's the way they're salvaging it. This ship was built in 2017. It's only 2 years old. And normally you would roll her over onto her side. You would fix some solid placements in the dirt, get some winches and roll her on her side, ballast her up and get her out. Problem is ships are built to such different standards today that they can't sustain a lot of damage. And she suffered a lot of hull damage along her side, along her bottom, and along her side. Again, because of engineering techniques, you don't have to have very thick steel on these vessels except in key areas. And so a lot of steel is very thin in areas. Again, that's not so much dangerous, but when you have damage like this, you can't repair it. So it was more economical to slice this vessel into pieces and cut it out. The problem with this is it's taking forever for it to happen. It is just going on. She again ran aground in September 2019, and she is still there. The salvage of the vessel is estimated to cost $400 million, and it's just taking forever. You go to Jekyll Island in Georgia or outside of Brunswick, you can still see her there. They've gotten a couple of slices off her. The first, I think, three off the bow. I think it's total 8 slices they were going to do. They did the first one off the stern. The seventh one, which is the second furthest from aft, had given them problems, and they're restarting it again, trying to get her cut free. But again, you can go here and follow the full salvage here at G Captain. Uh, Greenhouse emissions, shipping's greenhouse gas emissions. So one of the biggest things going on right now is the research into propulsions for vessels. So normal ships use diesel engines. That's the norm as always. These big, slow speed, massive diesel engines is what they use. But because of exhaust from these vessels, they come to port and they emit a lot of exhaust. They just do. It's very efficient if you weigh it against the tons of cargo in it. It's less than trucks, rail, you name it. But when you come into port, you're emitting a lot of emissions right there. And so one of the things they want to do is see about how they can basically start changing that. As I say here, shipping represent nearly 3% of global emissions. So new types of propulsion systems are being looked at. Liquefied natural gas, which is you can't carry enough liquefied natural gas on a vessel to power it solely by LNG. But when you come into port, you can switch over to LNG tanks, run on LNG, and your emissions drop dramatically. Ammonia as a fuel is an interesting idea. Hybrid battery power. They are looking at everything. One of the interesting things we're seeing right now in shipping, for example, is a lot of companies are building new vessels. I talked about Evergreen building new container vessels. A lot of companies are building new container vessels. Uh, One of the biggest is Maersk. They're not building anything right now, and they're hedging their bet right now because they're watching this emissions. Because when you go to 2050 and you have to cut your gas emissions by 50% versus 2008 levels, well, if you start building a vessel today in 2021, that vessel will come out in 2022, 2023. That vessel may be around 2050. And so you want to make sure you've got the right propulsion plant, or else your vessel will be basically scrapped. And so some companies are waiting. We're seeing these leasing companies building vessels, C-SPAN, a few other companies doing that. And it's better to lease a vessel than to buy vessels right now. And so it's going to be interesting to see how this goes in. The commercial industry is always innovative in propulsion systems. And that's one of the things we're seeing right now. I'm not sure how this will impact government vessels, Navy vessels, for example. Military vessels are basically exempt from these emission issues. But again, there's always pressure on them to adapt new emission standards. MV Wakashio. Wow, this was a terrible story. If you didn't see this story, this is one of those stories that should have resonated a lot. Bulk carrier, empty, coming from China, heading back to Brazil, runs into Mauritius. Mauritius is an island in the southwestern part of the Indian Ocean. And Mauritius is beautiful, absolutely just beautiful island, pristine, just absolutely gorgeous. I mean, just, again, if you can imagine a tropical paradise, Mauritius is it. And the Wakashio ran right into it. I mean, just right into it. There was a lot of allegations here about what happened. The first stories that came out, and as always, first stories, was they were trying to get close to the island to get cell reception because the crew had been on for a while. They wanted to get, cell reception and download, Netflix and call home and email and all that kind of stuff. Uh, that's obviously not true. Came out not true. There was a issue here with the crew on not basically tracking where they were accurately. It's a lot of automation on the bridge now, GPS, global positioning system, electronic charts, you name it. Uh, and some things that happen can cause what they call here deviation to pick up. And as you get deviation, it can knock you off course a little bit. So, for example, I know on a vessel I was on when GPS was just coming out, we kept getting an offset from our GPS position with our actual position. It was never matching up right. And one of the reasons was we had incorrectly set the antenna height for our GPS. You have to put a height in your GPS. If not, it thinks you're at sea level, and that measurement is different than if you're 80 feet in the air, like where our GPS antenna was. And so sometimes that happens, and that's exactly what we saw. So that was bad enough, but then there was a terrible, terrible salvage and response by the International Maritime Organization. The IMO sent a representative to the island, which was comical if it wasn't funny, because what eventually happened is, because of the poor salvage operation, even though this vessel was empty, she broke apart. She broke apart, and one of the things they did not do was remove the fuel oil from her. So they had a fuel oil spill on this pristine shore. It just was disastrous. It was horrific, and actually, it was an accident that did not need to happen. Again, we saw how fast you can salvage vessels with Ever Given, 6 days to get that vessel off. Wakashio should have been salvaged as quickly, if not quicker. I mean, she'd just run up on a reef. She should have been able to get off. She should have been able to basically, get spill material around her. Should have been able to pump her fuel oil off. No reason that should have happened. And instead, it was just a disaster that didn't need to happen, which is ironic because, again, the maritime industry has actually become much better at responses to this. The problem here you have was Mauritius isn't high on everybody's radar. The IMO sent representatives who they should never have sent because it was just they were giving false information, in my opinion. Again, my opinion. People can differ. The IMO will differ, but what led to here was the vessel breaking up and a pollution incident that didn't need to happen, just did not need to happen. COVID restocking. So, one of the things that initially happened, and again, we're seeing this right now because Ever Given, great story, and I'm going to talk about it tomorrow. Maersk Lines put out a story in the Financial Times that we're going to see disruptions in the supply trade at least till mid-May. COVID restocking is one of those issues. So when everything shut down in Wuhan, China, and China was the first one we know that had COVID. I'm not being racial. I'm just saying this is where it started. What you saw was a slowdown in vessels loading and cargo going to the docks, which doesn't immediately impact anybody because ships are already loaded sailing. Ships are arriving in port. You have several weeks until this hits. And what we saw was when that hit, all of a sudden there were shortages. Everybody knows about toilet paper and paper towels. There was no shortage of paper towels and toilet paper in the world. There was shortages of paper towels and toilet paper where you needed them, and when you need them immediately. And so what happened was there was a reaction to that, and people started shifting their buying habits. Instead of going to stores, it was e-commerce. And now all of a sudden there's this capacity crunch. And now all of a sudden, ships were being loaded to the gills. And now ships are, months after COVID, and China, is not locked down, starts sending cargo like crazy. But the problem is US ports can't handle them. Why? Because there's COVID lockdowns, there's not enough workers, there's not enough rail workers, there's not enough infrastructure capacity. And what we see right now is this issue germinating in our ports. Uh, Exports for the U.S. to get out aren't getting out. Why? Because companies want empty containers returned, not fully loaded containers, because a fully loaded container has got to be shipped, it's got to be unpacked, and then returned back to the pool for loading. They want empty containers back because they want to load them right away. And what this means is American exporters, in particularly, were not getting their goods out. This led to a problem in the United States because we don't have a lot of we don't have a lot of domestic U.S. flag vessels hauling our exports. And so the Federal Maritime Commission had to get involved. Rebecca Dye, who's one of the commissioners, who I think does a fantastic job, has been leading this. But the problem with the FMC is they don't have a lot of power. They just don't. And so they've been doing this study since March, not March last month, March of the previous year. So 13 months. They've just came out with some issues and ways to get some refunds. But again, it doesn't really penalize the carriers at all. And so this has caused disruptions in the global supply chain. What we saw happen with Ever Given is a microcosm of this. And again, I'll talk about this tomorrow in the video on Ever Given. One APIS. Wow. So the other issue going on here is hauling cargo across the Pacific and in large numbers. And we are going at a fast rate, loading these vessels extremely high. And some of these vessels are taking routes they probably don't want to take. A Great Circle route, the shortest distance between Shanghai and Los Angeles, for example, takes you up to the Aleutian Islands. And because if you look at a flat map, it looks like it should take you by Hawaii, but the world's not flat. Sorry, flat earthers. It's not, it's round. And so if you put a string between Shanghai and Los Angeles on the globe, you'll see that the straight line on a flat map looks like a big, huge curve called the Great Circle. And Great Circle in the wintertime in the Pacific is terrible. The North Pacific makes the North Atlantic look like a tame pond. I'm sorry. The Pacific is much more wild. And one of the things that you see is these forces on some of these ultra large container vessels can result in this. This is the ONE APIS, not the one APIS, but the ONE APIS. And she reported losing a significant number of containers overboard. I think significant number to me is something in the range of 1,300 containers. Give you an image is a great video here. Let me pull this up here. This is drone footage that was done of ONE Apis as she came in here. Let's put this up here for you. This is her coming in. One of the things to notice on this is look how the stacks are. Here you see the stacks leaned over to the starboard side back aft. So you can see she lost containers on the port side. They went over the way, and then these stacks just fell over, which is just incredible. Again, because you have cell guides here for below the top 4 or 5 stacks. So they should be locked into place, but they're just metal. And so they can bend and everything. But what I want to show you is here, these stacks are leaned over the starboard. And you'll see other ones like that. So she lost containers to port and starboard, which tells you this vessel was rocking excessively. And what happened is you started losing containers. And as the weight shifts on the vessel, the stacks just went by the wayside. And you can see the other collapses. You actually have within the ship itself cell guides, so they lock in place. So the bottom half of the stack is locked in place. You have some cell guides for the bottom 2, 3, 4 stacks on deck, but then the stacks above that are just using basically wire guides. The X, you see these X's on the back of the containers, and then you use these tightening devices to basically lock them in. And if you don't tighten them well enough, then they can basically come loose. And let me go back and do that one more time. And what happens is you periodically on a voyage have to go around and tighten those turnbuckles again because they will work loose. Well, when you have a crew of 24 and you're carrying 18,000 containers, you can't get and look at all those turnbuckles. Plus, if the vessel is in high wind, high seas, you can't get on the top stacks and do that. It's too risky. And what you have is this: the loss of containers on board. Loss of containers is a problem. You can have hazardous waste material in here. Hazardous material goes overboard. These create menaces for navigation because some of these containers don't sink. They stay at the surface and vessels run into them. Robert Redford did that in a sailboat. And more importantly, people lose products. I mean, they lose everything that they're expecting on. And this is not an isolated case with the ONE Apis. We've seen multiple other vessels suffer this same loss. So it's a tragic event. All right. That was the main stories. Those are the biggest stories, or I shouldn't say the biggest, but those are the ones that Mike Schuller at GCAP put together. I think they're great. It's a great year in review to look at. They also have a most popular stories, the 10 most popular stories at GCAP, which kind of follow this. There was a couple other ones that chimed in there, but I thought that this was a great way to kind of introduce you to maritime news. So hope you liked it. Again, if you have the opportunity, again, please subscribe to my channel. Give it a thumbs up if you like the video. Hopefully my audio quality is much better and louder. Sorry, this is a low budget operation here. We don't have a lot of funds at Salmer Cogliano YouTube page, so we try to make it as best as we can for everybody. So I appreciate it. Appreciate all the follows. Appreciate the likes, and again, always look forward to comments on what I can provide and talk about in the realm of maritime news and industry and history always. So thanks.